this meeting to order. Bienvenue à la réunion numéro 130.
Welcome to meeting number 132 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. Pursuant to Standing Order 108.3H and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 13th, 2024, the committee is resuming its study of the impact of disinformation and of misinformation on the work of parliamentarians.
I'd just like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour today. From the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we've got Richard Balin, who is the Director General Cybercrime and Chief Superintendent Federal Policing Criminal Operations. Welcome. Denis Baudouin, le Directeur Général.
Director General, National Security and Chief Superintendent, Federal Policing. Welcome to our committee, Mr. Baudouin.
Ian, who is the Director General, Federal Policing, Security Intelligence and International Policing. I want to welcome you, sir. So you have up to 5 minutes for an opening statement to address to the committee. Je vais passer à Monsieur Baudouin. Oui.
Mr. Baudouin, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Honorable Chair, committee members, my name is Denis Baudouin. I am a Chief Superintendent and the Director General responsible for foreign actor interference for the Federal Policing National Security Program at the RCMP. I am joined today by Chief Superintendent Richard Balin of Federal Policing, Criminal Operations, Cybercrime, and the Director General of Federal Policing, Security Intelligence, Greg Ohan. First, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to discuss this issue. The malign intrusion into Canada's democratic processes by hostile foreign actors is one of the highest priorities of the RCMP. To be clear, foreign interference affects every aspect of society. This includes the very foundations of our democracy, the fundamental rights and values that define us as a society, our economic prosperity, the critical infrastructure essential to our well-being, and our sovereignty. Foreign actors seek to advance their objectives through several tactics, including state-backed harassment and intimidation of communities in Canada, manipulating the discourse in every level of our politics, and using malign and deceptive tactics to influence our democracy. Make no mistake, foreign governments are conducting campaigns of online disinformation to undermine our democratic processes and institutions, as well as to erode citizens' faith in democracy. The RCMP has a broad mandate related to national security and cybercrime to ensure public safety by investigating, disrupting, and preventing foreign interference. It draws upon authorities from various legislation, including those recently enacted in Bill C-70, as well as other offenses from the Criminal Code. When investigating disinformation campaigns, the RCMP works closely with domestic and international partners to identify relevant evidence. But sometimes, disinformation campaigns may not constitute criminal conduct. With these considerations in mind, I will briefly summarize the RCMP's role in contributing to the protection of Canada, its citizens, residents, and elected officials from foreign interference activities.
The Government of Canada announced its plan to protect democracy to defend Canadian democratic institutions. This includes measures to strengthen elections against various threats, including cyber as well as foreign interference. From the outset, the RCMP has been a committed contributor to these all-of-government efforts. Elected and public officials are central figures in our democracy's political system as they shape our policies and laws. This role makes them key targets for foreign states, which may try to influence or coerce them to take policy decisions that align with their interests. As such, the RCMP recently briefed parliamentarians in partnership with other government agencies on the threats of foreign interference. The RCMP is also leading initiatives to raise awareness with police forces across the country on the new legislation included in Bill C-70, as well as the threat of foreign interference. The RCMP is also an active member of the Security and Intelligence Threat to Elections Task Force, otherwise known as SITE, a working group that coordinates collection and analysis efforts concerning threats to Canada's federal election processes. This group is Canada's principal mechanism for monitoring threats of hostile state interference during elections, and also consists of experts from CSIS and CSC and Global Affairs Canada. The RCMP's federal policing cybercrime focuses investigative efforts on the highest level of cyber criminality and works closely with domestic and international partners to identify, disrupt, and prosecute the most serious threat within the cybercrime ecosystem that causes significant economic or otherwise impact to Canadian interests at home and abroad. The RCMP's federal policing cybercrime investigative teams and cyber liaison officers abroad focus on the prevention, enforcement, and disruption of high-value threat actors and prolific cybercrime enablers that facilitate sophisticated crimes such as malware, ransomware, espionage, foreign interference, as well as attacks against government institutions, key business assets, and critical infrastructure of national importance. As members of this committee are well aware, there's been an increase in threats to public officials in recent years. Recognizing the personal impact of this trend, as well as the harm it causes to our democracy, this issue remains a key priority for the RCMP, and we will continue to counter these threats through our federal policing responsibilities, as well as our engagement with other police forces and diaspora communities. With the threats of this magnitude, collaboration between the the police of jurisdiction and the Government of Canada partners will continue to be an important aspect of protecting Canada against foreign interference. The protection of Canada's democratic processes and the safety of its citizens and residents is paramount for the RCMP, and it will be important for all aspects of society to work together to protect against foreign interference in this space. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Baudin. And I do want to also thank the RCMP. Earlier this year, we had the opportunity as a committee to visit the academy in Ottawa, and through Deputy Commissioner Larkin, we got a pretty comprehensive briefing on the tools that are used for data extraction to monitor cyber crimes, et cetera, and foreign interference. Were any of you at that session that we were at? No? Okay. Just Mr. Fisher was. I see his hand in the back. We are going to start with our first round of questioning, 6 minutes on all sides. Every party has 6 minutes. And we are going to start with Mr. Barrett. Go ahead, Mr. Barrett, please.
Is the RCMP adequately funded to address the cyber threats that Canada faces?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I mean, I would. Earlier last week, Deputy Commissioner Flynn, I think, said quite clearly that you wouldn't be able to talk to a chief of police anywhere in Canada and not hear that. That there would be an interest in discussion around resourcing, but I can tell you that the RCMP does have our cyber teams across the country. We have worked to staff these teams, to build training, to adapt to the threats, and we do surge resources to that. So, and I do believe that we are, at this time, able to work at a level of criminality that is representative of the threat. Yes.
Okay, so other police forces need more resources. The RCMP does not. Is what I'm extrapolating from your answer. It's just a quick yes or no would be great. Are you properly resourced?
We are
to address the threats that are facing Canada.
It's worth having discussion about resources. Absolutely. But yes, I'll say we are resourced right now to deal with the threat.
Okay. Could the government be doing more to deter foreign interference and protect Canadians from intimidation from hostile foreign states?
It's hard for the RCMP to comment on the government, Mr. Chair. What we can say is that we welcome the new legislation in Bill 70, which has just recently been enacted on August 19th. So we look forward to be able to work with our with our partner at PPSC to test this new legislation. And like your earlier question was on cybercrime, on the national security and foreign actor interference. We received funding recently through the ASA-MC, but nonetheless, with the rise of violent extremism in Canada, it's certainly competing with our ability. So we have.
What's the operability like between the RCMP and the and CSEC to deal with these types of issues? CSEC is self-described as being responsible for foreign signals intelligence, cyber operations, and cyber security. So, is there a table that exists? I just need a very quick answer where you address threats from hostile foreign states, cyber threats targeting Canadians.
Short answer is yes, there is.
Okay, and the name of that is?
Would be NCREW, which is the National Cyber Response Unit.
Okay.
And there's a number of other committees and meetings that do discuss threats as they occur.
And if a Canadian were targeted by a hostile foreign state with a hostile attack, a malware or hacking attempt, foreign state sponsored, how would that, and it was intercepted by you or your partners at that table, the CSEC, how would that Canadian come to learn that had happened? So would you notify the individual that a foreign state had targeted them?
I mean, it really depends on the nature of what was found and who found it. But that committee would be the place where that discussion would take place and deconfliction would take place. And then a decision would be made going forward as to the nature of that threat and how to deal with it.
Of course, we had an example this year where parliamentarians across party lines were targeted, where it was revealed earlier this year, I should say, by a foreign state-sponsored attack, APT-31. And, of course, the individuals who were targeted were all legislators, and none of them were notified by anyone who sits at that table. So it's just interesting to know that conversation took place. I understand that that the paper got shuffled over to the House of Commons, but of course that gives cold comfort to the affected individuals and would leave other Canadians wondering what would happen to them if they were being targeted, and would they be informed, or do they have to depend on their employer to be notified and then informed, or should they wait for the FBI to let them know, which is what took place in this case, is how Canadians came to know that had occurred. There are a couple of issues that your federal policing is addressing right now, investigations into a few issues dealing with the government. Are you able to provide us with an update into the investigation dealing with the $60 million Arrive Can scam?
We're not gonna be able to comment on any investigation, and even this is outside of the national security portfolio. So definitely not the right person to answer these questions.
Did he say he's not able to answer the question? I can't hear what he's saying.
That's what I heard.
Okay.
Yeah, and Mr. Beaugen, if you just raise your voice a little bit more, it would be helpful. I'm having a tough time hearing, but he did say that, Mr. Barrett. So
Okay.
Yep.
The only thing I said is that we're not going to be able to comment on any investigation, whether any of them, and including this one, is outside of my responsibility. So I'm certainly not the right person to get these questions directed to.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Housefather, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you guys for coming. Does the FBI, the FBI, sorry, I feel like I'm in the States. Is the RCMP investigating right now as to whether there are foreign countries that are involved in the university encampments that happened last year and the protests that are happening to glorify terrorism and glorify Iran and Samadoun, you know, what Samadoun is doing? Are you investigating this?
Again, we're not going to be able to comment on any specific investigation today. So,
I'm not asking you to comment. I'm asking if you're looking into it.
Well, you're asking me to comment on investigations, and I've just explained that we're not going to be able to provide any details on investigations today.
I don't think the yes or no answer as to whether are you concerned?
Yes, we're monitoring definitely what is happening in Canada, and we have a number of folks looking at the current situation.
And when we have demonstrations like the one we had yesterday in Montreal, where McGill University buildings were damaged, where we had previous knowledge that these demonstrations were going to occur, what is the RCMP's role with respect to coordinating with local police?
So we engage with police of jurisdictions early when we know some things will occur, and we're in touch with them. And if and when something does occur, then we're going to liaise to see if there's a national security nexus to the incident.
But prior to something actually occurring, are you investigating to see if there's national security nexuses to the planned demonstration and advising local law enforcement accordingly?
Yes.
Okay. With respect to the question of, I understand why in the question that Mr. Barrett had asked, there would be times where you would discuss whether or not an individual should be made privy to information in terms of a foreign threat if you thought perhaps that individual was colluding with or an agent of the foreign source. But in the event that you realized that the person was blameless and was being, made susceptible to threats from a foreign source, what would be the reason the RCMP would not advise that individual?
There's a variety of reasons, including when we are dealing with foreign states conducting this investigation. So there could be caveats as to what we can do with the information. It could be a request from another agencies to not act on them. There's a wide range of reasons why we wouldn't at some point.
But you understand that, of course, to a parliamentarian, that's a very scary prospect, right? That there's a threat against, for example, me or anyone else, and you're aware of it, but I am not. Now, there seems to be, I don't know if it in terms of what the policing jargon would be, but it seems to be a disconnection between what the person who is being threatened by that foreign source would want to know and what you would be able to or would want to tell them. How do you protect somebody if in the event that they're not aware of this impending threat from a foreign source or an ongoing threat from a foreign source, and you can't tell them because, for example, your source in another country had asked you not to do so?
Yeah, so like I said, we take security of all Canadians, including parliamentarians, at heart. And like I said, I briefed all parties earlier in June myself to ensure that all parliamentarians are aware of the threats that may be upon you. So the RCMP takes this extremely seriously. On specific cases, like I said, we're not going to comment on investigations, but in general, like I said, there's a number of issues that come to play that we have to deal with, and sometimes we get to a resolution where we can advise a person. Sometimes there's reasons operationally why we don't, and sometimes we don't know either.
Do I have any time left, Mr. Chair?
You have a minute and a half.
So I want to then come to communications, because from what I gather, in the United States, law enforcement, the FBI, is far more willing to disclose information more rapidly and more clearly than the RCMP is. I see that with the Trump assassination, for example, where there's information that I think in Canada wouldn't have come out for a significant amount of time after the attempted assassination in Pennsylvania, but in the United States it was very forthcoming. The law enforcement agencies were out there giving information. I think there is a perception in Canada the RCMP should communicate in a much clearer and more forthcoming way, particularly as it relates to threats. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, privacy legislation are extremely different in our two countries, so I think that's something that we need to take into account as to what we do share. But we're out there, we're in the public, we're doing a lot of campaigns to assist Canadians at all levels to understand the threats upon them with different diaspora, so to ensure that people are aware of the current situation and the threats that is happening from foreign states.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Housefather. Just en avant de M. Trudel.
Just before we move on to Mr. Trudel, I just want to let the witnesses know that all members have 6 minutes to ask questions. And please don't take it personally if members have to interrupt you. It is simply because time is going very quickly. Time goes fast when asking questions. Mr. Trudel, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much to the witnesses. I would like to come back to what Mr. Housefather was asking. He was talking about the attempted assassination of Trump and how we heard quite quickly information, and you're saying that legislation is different here than in the States, and how would it have an impact on this file? What could be changed in Canadian legislation so that we would have access to this information? Answer. Firstly, I can't comment on the time that the FBI took to advise on the situation. But in Canada, legislation on information and privacy, these legislations are more strict. There are certain things that we cannot share publicly because of the Privacy Act. Question. In the United States, the FBI doesn't feel like they need to hide information, but here we do? What's the difference? Answer. No, I don't feel like we feel the need to hide information. I don't want to comment on what the FBI wants to do or doesn't want to do. For the RCMP, we don't want to hide information. We've had campaigns, many campaigns, to increase awareness regarding threats. I was looking for the word in French, and threats have changed over recent years, and we want to be as transparent as possible. When investigations are ongoing, we cannot share information. Question, you're talking about threats, and threats, are you saying, are more serious than 5 or 10 years ago? And so, do you not have the tools to counter such a threat? Answer, I stated to your colleague that threats are changing. There are people with violent ideologies. That's new. For foreign interference, it is a new threat. If we look at the past decade, the RCMP will always be thankful for investment in these programs so that we can do more for Canadians. Are there ongoing investigations regarding parliamentarians in Canada? I will not be able to comment on that. Earlier, in your opening remarks, you talked about interference and how it's not always criminal. Can you explain exactly what you meant? For misinformation? Could there be interference that is legal and interference that's criminal, and you only act when it's criminal? What's the difference? It's a matter, it depends on the topic, misinformation and disinformation. If somebody has a different opinion, that might not be criminal. There was legislation adopted in August which stated that if there's disinformation for interference in the electoral process, then it becomes criminal. And so there are things that we need to prove so that we can investigate. Earlier, you talked about threats being more violent. What were you referring to? We were talking about ideologies. We call it IMV. You're not talking about physical violence. No, we're talking about violent extremists who are motivated by their ideology. And so this threat has increased. And so we need to reassign resources depending on the threat and things that arise. There was an article published in the Globe and Mail this morning which states that the RCMP is struggling to respond to the threat of foreign interference from China, India, Russia, because they are acting within a mandate that is unclear. What should your mandate be so that you could be more efficient and take on the threat that is posed by those countries? What tools do you need to face these issues? We've received new tools. We received them about 6 weeks ago. We're eager to learn how to use them. We will always need more tools and more resources. Whether or not our mandate is unclear, I don't think so. But with the threat changing, we need to be able to better understand it. We need to offer training. We need to hire people from the community, and we need to adapt to these threats. Things are always evolving and are never the same. We might be moving to an election soon. Could be next week, 2 weeks. Who knows? Is there a way for you to prepare for such an eventuality? Apologies. I have to put that on because I'm hard of hearing. Regarding how we prepare for the next election, I can say that I represent the RCMP on the site task force, the Security Intelligence Threats to Election Task Force, and for about 8 months we've been preparing for the next election because we are expecting potential interference. Now, regarding the threat that you mentioned, quickly, please. Apologies. We don't have any time right now, but Mr. Trudel will have another 2.5-minute round. He can ask questions.
Go ahead, please, for 6, and then maybe a little bit more after that. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. As a part of the committee study on the use of social media platforms for data harvesting and unethical or illicit sharing of personal information for foreign entities, Bridget Govan, the Acting Assistant Commissioner of Federal Policing, National Security, and the RCMP, noted that the RCMP's National Security Program investigates criminal activities and that if the activities pertain to foreign interference, an investigation takes place. However, she emphasized that the RCMP does not investigate social media for misinformation, disinformation, or attempts to influence the platform. It investigates only if there is criminal activity. Why is the RCMP not investigating misinformation, disinformation, or attempts to influence on social media platforms?
Like I said earlier, some instances of misinformation and disinformation may not be illegal in itself. So the RCMP needs to look at whether a criminal offense has taken place. And when we establish this, then, of course, we will investigate, and it falls under the national security mandate. And when it involves cybercrime, then my colleague, Mr. Billim, would investigate.
So for the purpose of this committee, given the study that's before us, in what context, if any, could the spread of disinformation online be subject of an RCMP criminal investigation?
Like I mentioned earlier, it would be in relations to, with the goal to influence government processes, then that would become illegal.
When was the last time an investigation like that occurred? You don't have to give specifics, but just to give a sense for how often this might be the case.
One of the new section that just got enacted a few weeks ago.
So since this new section has been enacted, there's already been an investigation under the new parameters. Is that correct?
No, the only thing I'm saying is it's a very new law. So right now I'm not aware of it being used. But again, there's many investigations across the country.
So prior to that, there was nothing. Is that what I'm hearing?
On disinformation, it doesn't mean that like disinformations could come with threats, for example, then we could use the criminal code. We need to look at all the facts and not just the term disinformation. There's a wide range of criminal code offense we could use.
I need clarity because I'm a little bit not understanding the response. I understood you to say that the criminal threshold is if there was evidence of an influence campaign or a foreign interference that would change the government's policy. Is that not correct?
Yeah, it's interference in government processes.
Okay, so with that being said, have you in your career ever had an investigation that met that threshold?
Like I said, not personally, because this is a new law. It's been enacted about 6 weeks ago.
And again, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be stubborn here. Just to be clear, prior to that, there was no such investigation.
Government processes, no. But what I was trying to explain is that there's other section in the criminal code that disinformation itself may not constitute the offense, but foreign state actor could have committed other offenses in the criminal code that we could utilize.
Okay, again, in our study on social media platforms, Brian Larkin, the Deputy Commissioner of the RCMP's Specialized Policing Services, said that the RCMP has ongoing relationships with all social media platforms through its National Cybercrime Coordination Center, and that the RCMP also has protocols in place, particularly around things like child exploitation and harm to young people. Does the RCMP, given the new law, now have specific protocol in place for dealing with foreign states spreading misinformation online in Canada?
I'm not sure I understand the question, sir. You're asking if we have contacts within the social media platforms in regards to disinformation?
Mr. Larkin said you did.
Yeah,
I'm asking you.
Yeah, we do.
Do you have specific protocols in place for dealing with foreign states spreading misinformation online in Canada, whether it's through the National Cybercrime Coordination Center or any other policy or protocol you might have within the RCMP?
So we maintain, especially on the major platforms, we maintain contacts with their security branch on a wide range of investigations, because social media is used by all criminals, not just disinformation. So we maintain contacts with them for to obtain information when needed.
I'm sorry. I'm going to ask the question, and it's for the purpose of the study. Can you please provide this committee with the specific protocols that you have in place when dealing with foreign states spreading misinformation online in Canada? Can you do that for us?
I'm trying to answer the question, sir. What I was trying to explain is that we don't have specific, we don't police the internet. We don't have specific, we need a victim. So when people come forward with allegations of disinformation and criminal offenses that would have occurred on the platform, then we have protocols to engage with the social media companies to ensure we capture this information.
Can you give us some examples of how the RCMP engages with the public or the private entities that you've just listed or vulnerable communities to educate them about the risks of foreign interference activities?
Yeah, so if we get an example, you're asking example. So if we get a complaint on people that would have received threats or online from a foreign state or actors of a foreign state, then we would engage the social media platforms, sometimes on an urgent basis if there's threat to life, to obtain information on the perpetrator and to ensure that we ensure public safety and stop the threats to that person.
Okay. You'll have another chance, Mr. Green. We're going to come back to you in a few minutes. That concludes our first round. Mr. Cooper is going to start us off with our second round for 5 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Chair, on April 10th of this year, the Globe and Mail reported that in 2019, the then Liberal candidate, now Member of Parliament for Don Valley North, was tipped off by a Liberal Party member that he was being monitored by CSIS. It was confirmed at the public inquiry on foreign interference that only a select few top Liberals closely connected to the Prime Minister were present at classified CSIS briefing where this information was communicated. 3 top Liberals received the briefing, including Azim Ismail, the National Director of the Liberal Party. Mr. Ismail then briefed Jeremy Broadhurst, who did have the requisite security clearance, Broadhurst being a top advisor to the Prime Minister. Broadhurst then briefed the Prime Minister. So what we know is that 5 top Liberals, including the Prime Minister himself, were briefed. That information resulted in a leak in which a candidate, now Member of Parliament, was tipped off that he was being monitored by CSIS. Can you confirm that knowingly leaking classified information is an offense under Sections 13 and 14 of the Security of Information Act?
Yes, leaking classified information is a criminal offense.
And it would be fair to say that it is a serious offense punishable by up to 14 years behind bars.
Yes, I believe you're correct.
Yes. Following the Globe and Mail report, I sent a letter to the Commissioner of the RCMP dated April 12th of this year, bringing to his attention this apparent serious breach of national security, whereby evidence points to 5 top Liberals, one of whom, or more than one of whom, may have betrayed their oath of secrecy and leaked classified information, undermining ongoing national security operations. And on May 3rd, 2024, I received a letter from the Commissioner acknowledging my letter. Since that time, has the RCMP opened an investigation?
Mr. Chair, I won't be able to comment on any facts of whether we have or not an investigation.
Well, okay, fair enough. I understand you might not be able to comment on it if an investigation has been opened, but the Commissioner did say in his letter that the RCMP will examine this information. So has the RCMP examined the information surrounding serious allegations contained in the Globe and Mail report about a major national security breach involving top Liberals close to the Prime Minister, perhaps even the Prime Minister himself?
Mr. Chair, again, I'm not going to comment on this question.
Well, has the RCMP contacted any of these top Liberals?
Mr. Chair, again, I'm not going to comment
Well,
on
I think there needs to be a certain level of transparency. I know you can't comment on any ongoing investigation. I understand that. I respect that. I'll put it to you this way. Has the Prime Minister contacted the RCMP? Has he referred this national security breach to the attention of the RCMP?
Mr. Chair, same answer. I'm not going to comment on.
Well, it's interesting that you're not able to comment. It's interesting further that the Prime Minister has been silent about it. He certainly hasn't said that he has referred the matter to the attention of the RCMP. We have seen the Liberals at committee try to obstruct efforts to get to the bottom of this major national security breach. And frankly, what we've seen in terms of the Prime Minister's silence, obstruction by Liberal MPs, no doubt, directed by the Prime Minister, is part of a pattern with this Prime Minister, part of a pattern of a Prime Minister who has continually put his personal and partisan political interests and that of protecting top Liberals implicated in a serious crime, leaking classified information that may have compromised a CSIS investigation into Beijing's interference activities ahead of our national security. Canadians deserve better. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. We're going to go now to Mr. Baines for 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our respective Director Generals for joining us today. I wanted to talk a little bit about C-70, and I think you mentioned it's a welcomed legislative changes, some measures that were brought in there. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the cybersecurity and how it intersects with security of information and signal intelligence? If you feel sufficient improvements have been made through that legislation, and does it allow you to have more powers, more ability to do the work to target misinformation, disinformation, or any foreign threats through information specifically?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I can comment on one aspect of that from a cyber perspective. Certainly, it does give us more than we had, as my colleague Mr. Baudouin had mentioned. It's very early days, so we will see where that takes us and how much more room that gives us. But certainly there is more there than what we had before. Absolutely.
Yeah. So these changes have been brought in after decades of sort of going along the same, following the same measures. But the new offenses, the resources that are available now to you, do they satisfy your needs? I understand that it's new right now, and you're probably working through it. I think you said as of last week, some new laws are just enacted. Maybe speak a little bit to the processes that have been in place and how much work do you still need to do to really roll this out?
Thank you again for the question, and I can speak to that to a certain extent. Over the last, year to 18 months, maybe even 2 years, the threat related to cyber has evolved. Initially, cyber was looked at much more as a tactical threat, a criminal threat, and most of the evolution of cybercrime and cyber investigative teams was focused, on that aspect. And it's only more recently that our focus has opened up to looking at things like we're talking about here today, disinformation, aspects around more of a strategic threat from a national security perspective. So, that's where this legislation now has led us to, and we'll continue to work within the framework of that to see where it goes. But yes, absolutely, we do have more now than we did.
And then, does this allow you to increase your work with other jurisdictions, transnational misinformation campaigns, where it can be monitored with allies and things like that? Does that give you more abilities there?
It gives us more aspects of criminality to speak to, because we're speaking beyond just the, as I mentioned, that tactical threat, the criminal threat, and working within this space. So yeah, within our law enforcement and like-minded communities, these are the discussions that we do have now. The ecosystem of cyber that the RCMP likes to refer to, and our partners do, is made up of many parts, and many of those parts actually cross paths from that criminal side into that national security side. It might be some of the same threat actors, some of that same ecosystem, the infrastructure that we focus on, but we're now looking at it through a different lens, from a national security lens, and that is helpful to us as well.
And on the threat actors piece, have you identified specific platforms? We've seen how toxic X has become. Are you monitoring a little bit more on the social media side? I know you said you don't police it, but is there more? Are you noticing an increase in threats in certain spaces, other, dark web and these other spaces that are available to people?
Things like...
and maybe what actions have you taken to include into your processes?
Certainly, we have seen over the last number of years an evolution in that, and I think that it's been well reported on in the public and by not just the RCMP, but by law enforcement writ large. And that, again, is part of the aspects of many of the things we look at. You're talking about the dark web, certainly all sorts of different tools that enable criminality, that allow people that don't have sophisticated means, for example, to engage in things like ransomware, things like threats and so on and so forth, that didn't necessarily have the means, are now able to obtain those with a very low level of sophistication and conduct criminality. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Balin. Mr. Baines, pour 2 minutes et 30 secondes, Monsieur Trudel.
For 2 minutes and 30 seconds, Mr. Trudel, you have the floor. Let's get back to the conversation we were having on the election, Mr. Balin, whether it be in a few weeks or a few months, 1 month, we'll find out. I know that you can't comment on investigations. You've been looking at things for 8 months. What are your concerns? What could happen during a campaign? Iran, Russia, China, what could they do concretely? We've been preparing for months because there is a wide range of potential threats, whether it comes from violent extremism, as my colleague mentioned, or foreign interference. There's a lot of information that we are going to have to analyze and dig through. And this will be more significant than the 44th and 43rd elections. Now regarding what is most probable, I wouldn't be able to tell you. But because we're here to talk about disinformation and misinformation, that will be something we'll be looking at. What could they do? A country like China, what could they do? Could they use social media to boost the conservatives or the liberals? How would it work? Each country has its own goals. If we look at the documents from the foreign interference report, they talk about strategies that countries like China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, India, how all of their goals are different. And so you'd have to put yourself in the shoes of your adversaries and see what they would be looking for. In summaries that were given to the Commission for China, they were looking for social polarization, for example. Thank you. And Mr. Trudel.
2.5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I want to go back to just better understanding how the RCMP prepared for this meeting, understanding that we're talking about foreign interference. We've just had, I think, some major revelations vis-a NSICOP. I'm wondering, in preparation for this meeting, if either of the witnesses had the opportunity to kind of reflect on the global comparators where police services, national police services that would be akin to the RCMP might also be dealing with these same types of situations.
Mr. Chair, is the question, how did we prepare for the committee?
The question is, in preparing for the committee and preparing for this work, for this study, did you take a look at best practices in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, we always do, not just for this committee, Mr. Chair. We were part of the Five Eyes Committee.
So can you please provide what examples you would use from other jurisdictions that you would have as recommendations for this study?
I'm not familiar with the study, but what I can say is that there's several best practices that we use. I think one of them that we're trying to do right now on foreign interference is break the silos between police services. And when I say silos, is really raise awareness of transnational repression, because the officers on the street may not realize that he's dealing with such a crime, and he may just see it as a threat. So, for example, we're trying to utilize some of these committees that are already in existence to spread the disinformation, including Bill C-70, to all our colleagues across Canada. So that's one example that we're utilizing to share information.
In your opinion, what were the learnings
Mr.
from
Green,
the NSICOP reports?
Sorry, Mr.
Yeah?
Green, I've stopped your time because I want to make sure that our witnesses are clear of what your demand is and what you're asking them. So, because I think it's important for this study that we do get an answer. So, if there's some other way that you want to rephrase it so that I've stopped your time to give you that opportunity.
Thank you. I would ask, because of the nature of the time, if the witnesses from the RCMP would provide to us, this committee, in writing, any notes, any notes that they took, or any preparation memos that they had on examples from other jurisdictions that were dealing with this. He had mentioned that they're always looking at best practices. I'm keen to get recommendations from these witnesses here today for the purpose of our study. I don't know that I've necessarily gotten that to this point, and I just want to provide them the opportunity to provide in writing what direct recommendations they would take based on best practices from other jurisdictions in law enforcement.
Okay, I think I'm seeing some heads nod at the end of the table here, and I think they understand what the request is, and so I'm going to ask through the clerk to follow up with the parliamentary affairs people in the RCMP to make sure that we get a response to that. Mr. Baudouin, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I just want to apologize if I'm not answering the question to the level that you're seeking. It's certainly not on the will, so we'll happily provide a written response.
Yeah, and this is why I wanted to.
Once we get a clear questions that we fully understand the impact.
That's why I wanted to have this interaction so that we are both. All of us are clear on what the ask is. So, Mr. Green, I still have you for 40 seconds. Are you good? Okay.
I'm okay. I'm happy with that. Thank you for the intervention, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I don't normally do that, but I wanted to make sure that we had the information. We're going to go now to Mr. Caputo and then followed by Ms. Shanahan after that for 5 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Caputo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Chief Superintendent Bailyn. Thank you, Chief Superintendent Baudouin. And thank you to our Director General Ohayon. Hopefully I'm addressing you the proper way here. Yes, good. Thank you. I want to pick up where my colleague, Mr. Barrett, left off, and he was speaking about appropriate resourcing. Now, the Auditor General released a report in June of this past year. I assume that I'm not sure if you read that report. You're familiar with it. I see Chief Superintendent Bailyn is nodding his head with it.
I think we're talking about the same report, but I'll wait for you to
continue
the question.
It was a pretty major report in June. It talked about the RCMP and resourcing, and I know that it talked about resourcing generally, but my colleague, Mr. Barrett, did ask about resourcing, and I want to just take a quote here from that report and to put it to you, sir. And it says this: overall, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Communications Security Establishment Canada and the CRT, Canadian Radio, Television, Telecommunications, did not have the capacity and tools to effectively enforce laws intended to protect Canadians from cyber attacks and address the growing volume and sophistication of cybercrime. Now, I believe that's a direct quote from the Auditor General. What do you say to that?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. What I would say to that is that we've learned from that report that the evolution of cybercrime has required us to focus our efforts at a higher level. I mentioned the word ecosystem earlier. So we are evolving our techniques. We are evolving tools. I did also say that I'm always interested in having a conversation about resourcing and how we can better approach and deal, with the aspects of cyber criminality. But I also said earlier as well, you remember that And the Auditor General report did go back a number of years. And when we talk about our initial approach to cybercrime, cyber-enabled crime, frauds, and so on and so forth, where we've now evolved to that work that still needs to continue, but moving away from an incident response type aspect of cybercrime and working at a level of criminality that is about dismantling a system that enables cybercrime. So we're refocusing a lot of our efforts in that respect to make sure that we can adequately deal with the issue.
Full of that, sir. I just, given what the Auditor General has said, and given the slow machinations of government and how long it takes, and as somebody who prosecuted a great deal of cybercrime, I believe the Auditor General has put it quite clearly that resources are a problem. Resources are a problem. In this instance, we had one case the Auditor General highlighted with the CRTC, where in order to get around a warrant, I believe that that a device was essentially wiped or destroyed. In any event, I will move on here. To the RCMP superintendents, can you confirm that there are no PRC police stations operating in Canada at this time?
Again, I'm not going to comment on the ongoing investigation. It's been well detailed that there is ongoing investigations on this, so I'm not going to provide any further comments.
Well, with respect, I believe Minister Mendocino, as he was Minister of Public Safety, I believe he actually publicly commented on this issue in 2023, saying that the police stations had been shut down. Now, I think that this is a matter that concerns Canadians greatly, particularly groups that are targeted. And I'm just, candidly, I'm a bit surprised that we can't even hear in Parliament say whether or not there are police stations. I mean, I understand that there are active investigations, or there might be. I'm not sure if there might be. How can't we just say yes or no? These things are or are not operating, and how does that jeopardize an investigation?
So there is active investigation. To your point, saying there might be, I think it's been confirmed that there is active investigation. And again, I'm not going to comment further on this subject.
Okay. From what I can understand, and I know I don't have a whole lot of time, but my understanding is that the RCMP said that they shut these down, that this is in 2023. So if that's different in 2024, here we are as parliamentarians studying foreign interference. I think we should know whether or not there has been a change there. Do you have any comment to that?
I don't have any comments, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Caputo. Ms. Shanahan for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Monsieur le Président, puis je remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the witnesses who are with us today. In Châteauguay-Lacolle, my riding, Châteauguay de la Pierreville will be the new name soon. But there's a matter of social media, Facebook. Everyone is using these apps, and I think we're talking about misinformation and disinformation, and the definitions that can be confusing. I would like for you to explain in your words the definitions of both of these terms, please. For misinformation, or rather for disinformation, it's misleading information that has a purpose. So misinformation could be a misunderstanding. We're talking about intention here, correct? Could it happen that there is bad intentions behind misinformation that one could think is innocent but isn't? Yes, but what I can say to the committee is that these words are not found in the criminal code, for example. There's no offense. So the definition that people can give these terms can change. And this is an issue, correct, Mr. Chair? I imagine that we will focus on this in our report. I believe that people aren't aware of these definitions. It's hard even for those of us who are looking into this and have a better understanding. Malicious actors can be problematic. Raising awareness for the public is important, but also there needs to be awareness for businesses and vulnerable communities, for example, ethnic communities, but not only ethnic communities. Any community that could be susceptible to disinformation. Can you give us examples of awareness raising that the RCMP is doing for the work we're doing with ethnic communities? We have a process before an election. What we do is that we have commitments with communities that are publicized. We try to work with communities directly because perhaps abroad police officers are not trusted, and we want to create links between communities and police officers here. We want to inform communities on C70, for example. I'm going to interrupt you. How do you do this? Do you host workshops? Do you go to community centers? And with industry, do you meet with chambers of commerce? How do you do this? I think you answered the question for me, actually. In Montreal, for example, I believe we were there in May or June this year, and we were working with a community there. We gave a presentation on police agencies throughout Canada and how we could work with them on foreign interference. We offered presentations with private security companies because sometimes foreign agents would hire private security firms, and so we taught them what to recognize or what to expect. We don't have the resources to do everything that we would like to do, of course, at a community level. We try to target certain groups to have as much impact as possible. And after that, we give certain communities presentations in person, and we're working with public safety to offer about 7 or 8 presentations in different Canadian cities. And we're working with the RCMP, National Security, and other organizations so that we can reach as many groups as we can and as many Canadians as we can. Thank you, Ms. Shanahan.
I have a question in relation to what Ms. Shanahan asked, and you talked about disinformation and misinformation. We've heard several definitions of that over the course of our study. I'm kind of old school. I remember when it used to be known as lying, to be quite frank. But you mentioned in the criminal code there was no distinction between or no identification of disinformation or misinformation in the criminal code. What's the equivalent in the criminal code that police agencies would use for the spreading of lies, et cetera? Would it be considered mischief in the criminal code, or what would you use to apply that?
I'm not sure, misinformation in itself is a criminal offense, Mr. Chair.
Disagreement that you have or a difference of opinion. Those are the definitions you stated earlier and what we've heard in previous testimony.
Yeah, the biggest difference with Bill C-70 is that if a campaign of disinformation with the purpose to affect government processes, it may become criminal. But like you won't find these terms under the Security of Information Act. They're not defined in there. So I think it may be something for the committee to, as the member alluded, to see if there's value in defining them. But for police services, we're dealing with harassment, we're dealing with intimidation, threats. So these disinformation, if somebody goes through this, but at some point he crosses the path and there's a threat, then all of a sudden, we investigate the threats, but not necessarily the lying, as you called it, that it used to be called, because oftentimes it may not be a crime.
Okay, I appreciate all of you being here today and providing us with some valuable information. There was a request by Mr. Green. I'm going to make sure that the clerk follows up with Parliamentary Affairs. Generally, I try to put a timeline on the responses, so a week from today, perhaps at 5 o'clock, if you can supply that to the committee. I understand it's Thanksgiving weekend, but there should be ample time to address Mr. Green's questions. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. I'm going to suspend for a couple of minutes as we get ready for the next panel. Meeting is suspended. As we switched over to the second panel, I'd like to welcome our witnesses for the second hour today. As an individual, we've got Heidi Torek, Professor, History and Public Policy, University of British Columbia. Welcome, Ms. Torek. From Civics, and I'm familiar with Civics. I've done some local programs in Barrie, as I'm sure other members of Parliament have. Kenneth Boyd, who is the Director of Education. From the Russian-Canadian Democratic Alliance in person, we've got Maria Kartasheva, who is the Director, and Guillaume Sirois, who is Counsel. So we're going to start with you, Professor Torek. You have up to 5 minutes to address the committee with an opening statement. Go ahead, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and the committee for inviting me to discuss this important topic. So I'm a professor of history and public policy at the University of British Columbia, where I direct the Centre for the Study of Democratic Institutions, or CSDI. At CSDI, we aim to understand the past, analyse the present, and train for the future. So I'll make 3 points today, one about the past, one about the present, and one about the future. First, the past. Mis- and disinformation are a feature, not a bug of the international system. So too is foreign interference in elections. The US feared French interference all the way back in 1796. In the second half of the 20th century, the two Cold War superpowers, the US and Soviet Union, intervened in around 11% of all national executive elections around the world. The question is not if foreign interference will happen, but rather why some states engage in this practice at particular moments. Some of my research examined why Germans tried to use the then new technology of radio to influence global politics from 1900 to 1945. Germans wanted to interfere in foreign information environments because they felt boxed in politically and economically, and losing World War I accelerated those feelings. This obviously did not end well. The Nazis built on decades of experimentation to spread racist and anti-Semitic content, ending in a world war of words as well as weapons. So without getting into more historical weeds, this shows that analyzing international relations actually helps to predict potential foreign disinformation campaigns. This phenomenon will not disappear, but it will wax and wane. So we need systemic interventions to embed resilience through educational initiatives, platform interventions, transparency, research, and other measures to strengthen democracy. Second, the present. The current social media and AI environment has created new economic incentives for mis- and disinformation. For understandable reasons, these committee meetings are focused on politics, but making money fuels the problem too. We need stronger enforcement of electoral regulations on platforms to guard against this during elections. Canada might also coordinate with other democracies facing the same problem. For example, an intergovernmental task force could coordinate on issues like demonetizing disinformation. This could draw lessons from other multilateral institutions like the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF. More broadly, Canada has much to learn from other jurisdictions, like Finland on media literacy, or Taiwan on transparency and combating disinformation, while preserving freedom of expression. Third, the future. Generative AI, or Gen AI, is obviously at the top of most people's minds. I recently co-authored a report released by CSDI on the role of Gen AI in elections around the world in 2024. We found that Gen AI is currently pervasive, but not necessarily persuasive. Yet it still creates problems. And we find that Gen AI threatens democratic processes like elections in 3 main ways. First, it enables deception by lowering the barrier to entry to create problematic content. This accelerates problems that already existed on social media platforms. Second, Gen AI pollutes the information environment by worsening the quality of available information online. And third, Gen AI intensifies harassment. It is far easier to create deepfakes that may be used to harass female political candidates in particular. We should worry about this amplification of online abuse and harassment of political candidates, something that I've studied in Canada since 2019. This could target specific individuals or underrepresented groups to force them out of politics. To date, there is little evidence that the beneficial use of Gen AI in elections will outweigh these harmful ones. Multiple measures are needed to address the challenges of Gen AI. Although not election-specific, for example, the British Columbia Intimate Images Protection Act offers one avenue to protect female political candidates from deepfakes, and we should look for similar legislation to address other challenges posed by Gen AI. To sum up, the past tells us that disinformation is not going anywhere, but we do have power to mitigate it. The present tells us to grapple with the economic incentives too, and the future warns us to address issues with Gen AI like deepfakes before they get out of hand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Under time, we appreciate that. Mr. Boyd, we're going to go to you next for 5 minutes, or go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Kenneth Boyd. I'm the Director of Education at Civics, a national nonpartisan charity that is dedicated to building the skills and habits of active and informed citizenship. We work primarily with K-12 teachers from every province and territory, providing free programs in both English and in French on the themes of democratic engagement, civic discourse, and digital media literacy. Members of the committee may be most familiar with our Student Vote program, which is our parallel election program for students under the voting age, as well as our Rep Day program, which invites MPs and other elected officials into classrooms to engage directly with students. We approach digital media literacy as a necessary component of informed citizenship. Engaging in the democratic process requires that citizens be able to identify reliable and trustworthy sources of information and have the skills to determine the difference between fact and fiction. We know that the effects of mis and disinformation online can interfere with engaged citizenships in ways that go beyond being merely misled. For example, in a recent survey that we conducted with 800 teachers from across Canada, we found that 81% of respondents said that they believe that mis and disinformation on social media contributes a great extent to the spread of hateful rhetoric in their schools. Lacking the ability to engage critically with content online thus has downstream consequences in terms of people's ability to have constructive and meaningful conversations about important issues. To address these problems, we created Control F, our digital media literacy program that teaches empirically supported verification skills that have been proven to increase people's ability to determine the veracity of claims and identify the motives of unfamiliar sources online. Since 2019, Control F has been used by over 5,200 teachers who have taught the program to more than 300,000 students from all across Canada. We are consistently updating our program to address new kinds of mis and disinformation online, including those produced by artificial intelligence, and are currently adapting our resources for use by adult learners. While digital media literacy skills are necessary for everyone, it is especially important that students learn these skills at a young age. There are, however, a number of challenges in teaching effective digital media literacy to Canadians. I will note that while we recognize that education is a provincial issue, it is worth highlighting the issues that we have seen in our work in schools and with teachers, as they are indicative of problems that all Canadians face. First, our research has shown that the resources that are available to Canadian educators vary widely in terms of quality. Provinces can mention educational resources but not mandate their use, and many outdated resources are still used in classrooms and used by Canadians nationwide. In some cases, these resources were developed before the widespread adoption of the internet, and others have even been shown to backfire, making people less trusting of credible sources. Digital media literacy is also not a singular thing. It is an umbrella term that encapsulates many different concepts and competencies. However, educators and Canadians in general are given little guidance about which resources are available to them and which are high quality and grounded in evidence. Second, there is an overall dearth of digital media literacy training. For example, it is a common occurrence to find educators in charge of digital media literacy instruction who have no specific training in the subject matter or who received their last training when studying to become a teacher. Even for those who choose to inform themselves about the latest developments in digital media literacy, the online world moves and changes so quickly that it is difficult to keep up. In response to these issues, we believe there needs to be a national strategy to facilitate digital media literacy training. Through our work, we have found that in terms of scalability, it is most efficient to train educators as well as civil society organizations and community leaders to reach as many Canadians as possible. We also encourage the committee to consider approaching the problems of mis and disinformation as being a widespread skills issue rather than simply an awareness issue. Merely making people aware of the need to critically engage with content they find online will not help us make any progress. Canadians need access to and training in digital media literacy skills, and that requires a sustained investment from the federal government to ensure high-quality resources are available and programs can continue to operate effectively. Finally, informed citizenship requires access to high-quality information. In our resources, we say that the online information environment is polluted. Trustworthy information can certainly be found, but mis and disinformation are mixed in. Disinformation also tends to be free and easily accessible. Indeed, it is in the interest of the purveyors of such information for it to be as easily accessed as possible. So there is a real need to take steps to limit the degree of information pollution online. One way to address this problem is to support journalists, especially local journalists, who are able to provide reliable information and give Canadians better options to find important information online. I'm happy to address any questions the committee has, and I thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Boyd. We're now going to go to the Russian-Canadian Democratic Alliance. You have up to 5 minutes to address the committee. Go ahead, please. There you go. You're good. Good to go.
Honorable members of the committee, I am Maria Kartasheva, Director of the Russian-Canadian Democratic Alliance. I am accompanied by our counsel, Guillaume Sirois. Thank you for your invitation and for addressing the national security threat posed by Russian propaganda and cognitive warfare. The RCDA is a volunteer-led nonprofit organization created in the wake of Russia's criminal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Our mission is to support the development of the Russian-Canadian community around the ideals of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Opposing the invasion of Ukraine and Putin's regime is central to our work. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude for your recognition of the serious threat that Russian information and influence operations pose to our democracy and society. Cognitive warfare aims to manipulate information and perceptions to influence thinking, destabilize societies, and achieve strategic objectives without direct military confrontation. Russia employs these tactics as part of a broader strategy, viewing itself at war with the West, including Canada. Understanding this context is crucial for developing effective responses to safeguard our democracy. I was myself a direct victim of this cognitive warfare. Russia sentenced me to 7 years in prison for disseminating truthful information about the Bucha massacre while in Ottawa. I even faced the threat of deportation from Canada because of my political activism. The RCDA, an organization which I co-founded, has been labeled an undesirable organization by Putin regime. This designation puts all our partners and collaborators, including myself, at a significant risk. One of our directors felt compelled to resign due to fears of persecution. This situation underscores the urgent need for decisive action to protect not only our democratic institutions, but also the individuals who actively work to uphold them. Meanwhile, despite Russia's long-standing disinformation campaigns in Canada, I have yet to see any individuals held accountable for facing consequences for their actions. Aside from public statements and ineffective sanctions, it appears that Canada is doing little to prevent Russia from gaining the upper hand in its cognitive war against Canadians. As we have learned notably in the course of the Foreign Interference Commission, there are 4 key ways that Russian propaganda is impacting the work of parliamentarians. First, Russian disinformation is shaping how Canadians, and by extension, members of parliament, think and vote on pivotal issues, including the support for Ukraine, NATO, and even domestic issues like inflation. Second, disinformation fuels fear and hostility, contributing to threats and violence against MPs, undermining their ability to perform their duties safely. Third, the saturation of disinformation contributes to growing political apathy among the general population, weakening democratic participation. Fourth, these disinformation campaigns aim to destabilize the very foundations of our democracy by spreading doubts about the integrity of elections and of our democratic processes. In response, the Government of Canada must do the 5 following things. First, annually assess the scope of Russian and other state-sponsored disinformation targeting Canada and report the findings to Parliament for transparency and accountability. Second, adopt a strategy to combat Russian propaganda, focusing on protecting the work of members of Parliament and the Russian diaspora from such disinformation campaigns. Third, establish an independent body similar to CRTC or Elections Canada to monitor, assess, and respond to foreign propaganda, ensuring the integrity of democratic processes is upheld. Fourth, engage with the Russian diaspora and civil society organizations to help identify and combat Russian propaganda. And fifth, enforce a decisive foreign policy that curbs Russia's disinformation with diplomacy and global partnerships, ensuring accountability for Russia's actions in Canada. In conclusion, Russian interference in Canada's democratic processes, as exemplified by the ongoing disinformation campaigns, represents a significant threat that must not be ignored. For decades, Russia has been conducting destructive operations like Tenet media operation with relative impunity. By recognizing the gravity of this threat and committing to serious action, we can protect our democracy for future generations. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer all of the questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all of our witnesses for very interesting opening statements. We're going to go to 6-minute rounds for each member, for each party, and we're going to start with Mr. Barrett. Go ahead, Mr. Barrett, for 6 minutes.
So, Mr. Boyd, I've had the opportunity to engage with your organization in both rep days, and I'm aware of how I fared out in the local student vote. And I'm as pleased with that result as I am with the general election and by-election results that I've had. And I'll give a shout out to St. John Bosco in Brockville and St. Edward's School in Westport, who've invited me to take part in rep days there. I think it's a great program. Always great questions that demonstrate the understanding that young people have, these students have, as a result of the efforts of your program, and that's certainly commendable. You talk about education being a provincial responsibility, but I wonder if you could quickly tell us about your funding. How much federal funding have you received, and how much provincial funding does your organization receive?
Yeah, we receive, I can't tell you exact percentages just off of the top of my mind. We are a registered charity, so all of our funding information is, of course, on the public record. But we do, I would say, receive in terms of our funding for our digital media literacy programs, especially receive a combination of funding from the federal government, from the Digital Citizens Initiative, as well from some private organizations, donors, research centers, as well as from some of the provincial governments as well. But I would say mostly in terms of this program, we've received from Canadian Heritage and from the Digital Citizens Initiative.
And the funding for, I believe that you've expanded your offerings overseas, Colombia and Chile. How are those initiatives funded?
Those initiatives are funded through independent grants that have been applied for by our teams in Colombia and in Chile. So they received a grant recently from the EU to continue funding their projects, and they have taken the work that we've done in Canada, especially on the digital media literacy programs, and adapted those for an audience in both Colombia and in Chile.
So teaching children how to navigate through what I think you described it as digital pollution. I think there's definitely lots of pollution online. I think that critical thinking and being able to discern what's real and what's not become more and more challenging all the time. What is one tangible thing, one tangible recommendation that you would make for us to include in this report that you think would improve digital media literacy for children across Canada?
I think there needs to be sort of an investigation into the kinds of resources that are effective, that are based in evidence, and that can be made. And as I mentioned before, we do understand education is more of a provincial responsibility. But in terms of being able to sort of make the recommendation that there are some tools that have been shown to be effective, to understand what those are, and to sort of make that known to not just to students, but to Canadians more widely, that there are effective digital media literacy strategies out there that can be learned. I think that would be something concrete that the committee could pursue.
Understanding of the uniformity of material that's being delivered across Canada in this space on civic literacy and digital media literacy. Is there any standard across the province between provinces and territories? And if so, what is it? And if not, is there even consistency within each province on the material that's being delivered across school boards?
In terms of the different provinces, there are it's commodified in curricula the requirements that digital media literacy or source evaluation be taught in some capacity. provinces are able to make recommendations or able to list possible resources, but they do not mandate the use of any particular resource. So that is to say that you might find different digital media literacy education happening between provinces and territories. There is no unified, consistent mandate to use some resources and not others.
What do you think is the most important way that your organization will protect its credibility going forward? Like, what steps are in place, whether it's for board selection or for screening funding sources, to ensure that as an organization that's charged itself with these important educational initiatives, how are you ensuring that you remain credible, unimpeachable in a very murky landscape of information providers?
Sorry, could you rephrase the question in terms of the credibility? I maybe missed the first part of that question.
10 seconds left, so...
Really, I was just looking what you're doing to protect your credibility, whether it's with selection of individuals on your board or screening funding sources based on the murky information landscape that's out there. How are you protecting your credibility as a source for teaching people?
I'm going to need a really quick response, Mr. Boyd. Really quick.
Very quickly, as I mentioned, we are a charity, so we are very transparent about all of our funding sources. So that is, I think, one way that we maintain credibility.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Shanahan, pour 6 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses all for being here, but I want to particularly turn my attention to a story that came out in the last month, which I'm sure that the witnesses are familiar with, and that is the story about Tenet Media. There is actually a connection to my home province of Quebec in that there were two people in our West Island locality, Lauren Chen and someone else, that were named in a U.S. indictment that they're alleged to have been spreading misinformation. It could have been that they were, as I think the technical term goes, useful idiots, but it could be that they were very knowingly doing what they're doing. I don't know. But let's talk about what was going on there. So according to the U.S. indictment, after Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, RT, or Russia Today, was sanctioned, dropped by distributors, and ultimately forced to cease formal operations in the United States, Canada, and United Kingdom, and the European Union. That's a very big market right there. In response, RT created, in the words of its editor-in-chief, an entire empire of covert projects designed to shape public opinion in Western audiences. The indictment goes on to allege that Tenet Media is one of RT's covert projects. How does the RT empire of covert projects hurt Ukrainian Canadians? And I'm asking that of Madam Kartasheva.
First of all, thank you for the question. I feel like asking that question, Ukrainian Canadians would be better, as I am representative of a Russian society in Canada. But I feel like Russian propaganda in general is hurting everyone, but specifically if we're talking about Ukrainians in Canada, I am sure, I was talking with one of the directors of URCC, and he was telling me that after the war and because of the Russian propaganda, they've seen horrendous increase of hate crimes against Ukrainians, whether it will be insults or just, some symbols outside in the universities or just, on the street. And we know that there are a lot more Ukrainians now in Canada, right? Because the war started and Canada opened its doors for them. And I imagine that for them, it's got to be very traumatizing to come from the war and see these hateful symbols around them. And from my understanding, Canada doesn't do enough to protect them or even to react to these crimes. So I guess.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. And in fact, for enlarging the question. I do want to point out that in my riding of Chateauguay-Lacolle, which will soon be named Chateauguay-Les Jardins de Napierville, because we have a wonderful agricultural region, we go right out to the American border, but we have a large number of Russian speakers of mixed Russian-Ukrainian heritage, and we were very proud, even a small city of Chateauguay, 50,000 people, to be able to receive over 100 Ukrainian families who were displaced after the invasion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so people were, it was all hands on deck, really a wonderful community project. And indeed, all of the group has since been disbanded insofar as the Ukrainians have completely integrated and are working and are, looking after themselves and their families, although the friendships are forever. So I just wanted to, it has sensitized our community, though, very much to this disinformation, misinformation, and how harmful it can be. How can we best fight back?
Well, it's a very important question, and I guess that's why we all gathered here. But one of the points that I was making is that there's got to be some kind of independent body that would be investigating these kinds of disinformation and provide recommendations to how to react to that, or maybe even sometimes enforcing some solutions for that. Because obviously it is a very complex issue, and the problem concerns not just, for example, a media like Russia today. This strategy of Russian propaganda, it's very, very complex. It includes social media, it includes different experts, in quotes, right, that go and do interviews on different media, including normal and respected media. It includes different professors. So it is a very complex issue that's got to be treated on all of these levels. And that's why I was proposing this independent body that would be coordinating this activity. Because if the issue is, if everyone is solving the issue, no one is solving the issues. There's got to be someone, like one body that's monitoring all that.
Thank you for that. And I want to thank you for the work that you're doing in sensitizing Canadians, indeed, that there are Russians here in Canada who are actively fighting for democracy, even at the risk of your own selves. And I appreciate the work that you are doing. Do you know of any other RT projects that are seeking to influence Western audiences?
I am not familiar with the RT on that level because personally it just pains my brain to watch, what they show and whatever they're doing. But I know that their strategies are very complex. And as I said, they do it on multiple levels. And I'm familiar with it because they do, honestly, pretty similar things in Russia as well, right? With the goal of disinformation, with spreading doubts amongst people, not trusting each other, not trusting the government, not trusting anyone. And so...
Thank you.
Oh, is this it?
Sorry,
Okay.
we're almost 45 seconds over there. So, Monsieur Trudel, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît. It's okay, Maria, it's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but my questions are for you, Ms. Torek. Disinformation, AI, social media, how to counter disinformation and misinformation. These are all things that raise important questions. There's a report that was published by ESDC and focused on the main disruptors, 35 main disruptors. And according to that report, disinformation is the biggest threat to the world currently. Ms. Torek, do you agree with this assertion?
So what I would say, thank you very much for the question. What I would say is that it underlies so many other threats, whether it's questions around war, climate change, etc. We see that disinformation is a part of all of those problems. So that's how I tend to think about it. And I would also say that what we see is that abuse and harassment is a key part of disinformation as well. And we never know quite who it's going to strike depending on the issue. So I would see it as an underlying foundation. And that's, I think, why it's such an existential threat.
Bon, si on parle de l'intelligence artificielle.
AI is a little scary when we think about it. That we could reproduce my face, my voice, and have me say just about anything on social media. And that's horrifying. How do we take on this problem? What legislation could we implement to ensure that during the next election campaign there wouldn't be a video of me on social media selling conservative programming, for example? How would we counter that?
So what we say in our report is that this is obviously something that has to be taken on in multiple dimensions. There's the companies themselves who are thinking about things like watermarking to see whether something is AI generated or not. So ensuring that something like that is implemented. We need the kind of programs like civics, but not just for schools, also for those who are not of school age. And we also need to think about different kinds of regulations. So we have a whole host of recommendations within that report, and I'm happy to share the report with the committee so that you can delve into those. But I think that the clear bottom line is that there's no one responsible party here. We need a range of different measures to be able to deal with this.
Bon, vous avez parlé, je pense, tantôt dans vos remarques.
Earlier in your opening remarks, you talked about AI and how it's been used in other countries and other election campaigns. What happened, and how were we able to detect that it was AI and not political truths?
So in some cases, for example, in Slovakia, there was a deep fake audio, and the person themselves obviously said that this was a deep fake. We've seen some in India as well. It's always very difficult to identify if this exactly changes someone's mind or not, but we have these kinds of singular examples that we point out in the report from countries all around the world to show that this kind of generative AI is at least being used. But for now, we don't find a lot of evidence that it's persuasive. That's why I say we need to get ahead of the problem before it becomes something that we can't really get a grip on.
Dans les pays que vous avez étudiés.
In the countries that you looked at, was the threat coming from another country, or was it coming from inside, from a political party?
That was unfortunately something that we couldn't identify. We didn't engage in those kinds of investigations, and sometimes it can indeed be very difficult. The example of Tenet Media is one that shows us that in that case, it actually wasn't about who was creating the content, it was about the financing behind it. And that's why I made the recommendations about thinking about financing as well as looking at the content itself, because you can have, in a way, things that happen off of the platforms that are actually influencing what kind of content is being created. So I think we need to combine not just think about the content, but also thinking about the actors and their behavior.
D'accord. Est-ce que vous pensez que...
Do you believe that there are political parties in Canada who are using disinformation for partisan reasons?
So that's a very difficult question to answer. As far as we know, political parties are obviously going to be pushing for themselves to win, but we haven't looked into specifically assessing what political parties are doing internally. That's obviously something that's very difficult for us to get at.
D'accord. J'aimerais poser la question à monsieur.
I would like to ask the same question to Mr. Boyd, the same question that I just asked. Do you believe that there are in Canada currently political parties that have used, are using, or intend to use disinformation for political gains?
I think I'll give the same answer that Professor Torok gave, which is that it is very difficult to determine if political parties themselves are internally creating this kind of information. So I certainly have no sense of what the intentions would be going forward. So I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry.
D'accord, merci. Plus de temps, Monsieur le Président.
Oui, merci.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Trudel. Mr. Green.
Sir.
My questions in this round are going to be for Ms. Turek. In a 2023 conference briefing note entitled Media Digital Literacy in an Era of Disinformation, it reflected on a presentation that you had made in 2022 and was published in the Journal of Intelligence, Conflict and Warfare. During this presentation, you had talked about the fact that misinformation and disinformation often overlap with online abuse. In fact, you referenced it in the previous round of questions that are directed towards professional groups, marginalized groups, for example, women, I think you referenced. And you said it's the foundation. And I'm wondering, like, why do you think that is?
So part of what we've seen in studies that we conducted since 2019 is that often these kinds of identity-based attacks, those kinds of harassment can have disproportionate effects on people from racialized communities, 2S LGBTQ+, or women. And this can often overlap with some sort of disinformation about those individuals. And the distinction here is that, of course, you can have vigorous and rigorous discussion about issues, but we often see with these groups that is melded with attacks on their identities, and that this has an influence, of course, on say political candidates themselves, but I'd like to add also on their campaign teams. And that's really important because those are often people who are thinking about going into politics, potentially becoming candidates. They see the kind of online abuse and harassment directed at a candidate and they think maybe politics is not for me. So if we're thinking about having a diverse legislature that represents the diversity of Canadians, we do need to address this issue.
You know, it's interesting that you raised that. I know that, for instance, this has been raised as a point by one of our previous committee members, Ms. Pam Damoff, who talked about this at length, the way in which political violence expresses itself. From your perspective, at what point do these campaigns cease being merely misinformation and disinformation and cross over into the rubric of political violence, or dare I say, kind of a proto-fascist approach to dismantling democracy in the country?
So that's obviously a big question that political theorists can debate. And I think I take in a slightly different direction, which is to say that these are often things that are actual threats against people's physical or psychological safety. And so there are all sorts of ways that we need to think about addressing this. A report that I co-wrote with Chris Tenove in 2020 gives a whole host of recommendations as to how we can try and address these kinds of things so that we can continue to have a democracy and hopefully build on a democracy that has a diverse group of political candidates and of representatives. So I'm happy to submit that report to the committee.
That would be good, because my next question would be, like, how do we look to minimize that type of online abuse? The two challenges that you highlighted during that 2022 presentation were the lack of explanatory journalism and the lack of social media expertise for some professional communicators trying to publish high quality information online. Can you explain these two challenges and whether there are initiatives in Canada to meet them?
Yeah, so in terms of lack of explanatory journalism, another way of thinking about this is just that we need to think about what journalism looks like in the 21st century, who can supply that information and so on. There are obviously a whole host of initiatives. I'll just highlight one, which is the Conversation Canada that was co-founded by a couple of my colleagues at UBC. The idea there is pairing academics who are very bad at writing op-eds mostly with journalists who are actually able to edit. So what we get there is academic expertise, but packaged in ways that most people can understand, and this can be freely reprinted. So that's just one sort of example of how we can amplify journalism, have it coming from experts. In terms of social media expertise, this is quite a problematic area now, because we see that social media platforms, even since 2022, have been increasingly shutting down the ability of researchers to actually access any data from platforms, whether it's CrowdTangle from Meta or access to data from X, which is now prohibitively expensive. So it's made it harder and harder for us as researchers to actually be able to access the sort of data that we would need to answer a lot of the fundamental questions that this committee is proposing. That's why bills like C-63 embed ideas around transparency for researchers within them.
That's algorithmic transparency, to understand how people are fed information. Is that what you're referring to?
So part of it is algorithmic transparency. Some of it is also questions around actually getting access to posts at all, because we're not actually able to access large amounts of posts from many social media platforms. So there are lots of questions, for example, about X, then Twitter, that we could ask in our study on political candidates in 2019 that I can no longer ask because I simply don't have access to that level of data.
And so, like, what I'm getting here is the commodification of information. I know that machine learning and AI, are able to go on and check the mood of the people on the platform in significant ways. Of course, this was referenced in the 2016 election under Trump in the way in which Cambridge Analytica and others kind of targeted people. From your perspective, what ways can we decommodify this kind of information capitalism to make it more democratic and transparent, as you suggested?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's no silver bullet, but researchers suggest a variety of ways. Some are looking at antitrust. That's obviously a lot of that happening in the US. Others are suggesting things around data privacy so that companies simply don't have access to so much information. Others are talking about whether we need public AI. That's Mozilla's suggestion, for example. So I think there's no one silver bullet, but there's a whole host of different potential options that we could explore.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Green. That concludes our first round. We do have enough time for 5 for the Conservatives, 5 for the Liberals, 2 minutes et demi pour Monsieur Trudel, and then 2.5 minutes for you, Mr. Green. That'll take us up to the allotted time. I am going to go now to Mr. Caputo for 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses here. Here are 2 that we have in person. Mr. Boyd on video and Professor Tork. And I note, Professor, you are from UBC, and as an SFU grad, I have to put in a friendly jab about the superiority of SFU.
Point of order, Mr.
In all seriousness, one of the things that has really bothered me about the about foreign interference, especially surrounding elections, is the amount of time it takes for the government to act. In other words, the people on the ground know exactly what's happening, and yet there is a significant lag time between that information getting to security forces in Canada and there being action taken. Would either you, Mr. Boyd or Professor Tork, have any input on that?
Maybe I'll just say briefly that obviously one of the things that I advocated for is thinking about transparency and how that can happen appropriately.
Mr. Boyd, any response to that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, as you mentioned, there is potentially inevitably going to be some lag time in these kinds of cases, but I think that points to the need to approach these problems from multiple different angles. So in terms of having Canadian citizens having the ability to help identify when information is being false or misleading, I think can be something that can help fill the gap before there's action taken by any sort of federal agency.
And okay, so let's build on that. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, Mr. Sirois has something to add here. Thank you.
Yes, if I may add, Russian propaganda especially has been an issue for a very long time, at least for a decade or maybe more. And we've learned through the Foreign Interference Commission today that the strategy to address this foreign interference is at a nascent stage. This is a very long delay to address a national security issue like foreign interference. And we've seen the consequences of that with the Tenet media operation. Had we had a strategy sooner, for instance, after the 2016 interference during the presidential election, maybe we wouldn't be here today talking again about foreign interference.
Well, I certainly agree with you, Mr. Sirois. If I have to be candid, which I believe I should be in these committees and in Parliament generally, I have seen a lack of political will to address this head-on. And frankly, that falls at the feet of the government. And I've said this at just about every committee meeting we've had. We have 11 people who have wittingly or semi-wittingly, according to our security forces, worked with hostile foreign states. And you talk about confronting this and confronting it early. I believe the term you used was nascent, at its nascent stages. And yet, this is information we know, that our security forces know, and yet we as Canadians don't know. We've asked so many times of our security apparatuses, and yet it feels like we get no further information. Is that just not completely the opposite of the approach we should be taking, of shining the light, shining it brightly, and shining it early?
Yes, thank you for your question. I think we both agree that transparency is the key to answering to foreign propaganda, such as the Russian interference we're discussing today. And this is transparency allows for the beginning of the conversation on how we can address this issue. If we don't know what the government is doing behind closed doors, we cannot have a proper discussion about what it should be doing or what the government is doing wrong.
Now, Ms. Kartasheva, did I pronounce that correctly? You had mentioned something that you, at the beginning, that caught my ears, that you were sentenced to 7 years in jail in Russia, I guess in absentia? Okay. Do you want to talk about that? This is your time if you want to discuss that, any impacts, and what other people in your position go through. Feel free, the floor is yours.
Well, I guess the worst part for me was that I didn't receive the support from Canada in time. I received it later after I managed to get media attention, but for months I was struggling to get any attention, or even like my MPs, which she apologized later because apparently there was some mistake on her assistant's part. But for months I felt completely abandoned by Canada, and I'm very worried that this might happen to someone else. In short, what happened is that I had my citizenship application being processed at the time when I was sentenced in Russia, which I at first was obviously arrested, then I was sentenced, and so I informed the IRCC about this, which IRCC basically ignored, and my first citizenship ceremony was canceled. And then I received a letter half a year later saying that I might not become a citizen because of that, because I'm a criminal in Russia.
Something from IRCC, just so I'm clear, saying...
Half a year later, I was writing to them several times, asking if there is any progress, which they said that we are reviewing your case, everything is fine, and then they sent me a letter saying that you have a month to send us all the documents that you might want to provide. And they sent it to me in the beginning of December, just so you understand. So it was months, and it was holidays. No one was responding for my requests to send me any documents. So it was great time.
Okay. Yeah, the worst part of my job is having to cut somebody off who's telling their story.
I'm sure that perhaps one of my Liberal colleagues will allow you to. I think this is worthy of hearing.
Let's see if Mr. Baines will take you up on that offer. Mr. Baines, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I will, if you want to continue.
Basically, my biggest issue and the fear that my colleagues in the organization have, and a lot of Russian citizens in Canada have, is that they will have problems in Canada when their citizenship or other immigration documents are processed, is that if they are persecuted in Russia, it will affect their stay in Canada. And the biggest fear I had was that I will be deported. And I had to live with that fear for a month every day because I didn't know how this will end. And again, no one apologized to me. I don't know why this happened. Maybe there is someone in the RCC who was interested in stopping me from becoming a Canadian citizen. Maybe there was someone there who wanted me to get back to Russia and end up in prison. I don't know. There was no investigation to my knowledge, and I don't know if there would be any investigation. I created a petition to prevent these cases from happening by making a list of foreign laws that will not be preventing people from becoming citizens or getting visas. But IRCC responded that their system is perfectly fine and is working in interests of people like myself. So you might be the judges of that, because I don't agree. And I feel gaslighted by IRCC and I guess Minister of Immigration, and I'm not happy with that.
Well, thank you for sharing, and I apologize on behalf of the government, and I wish there's some resolution that we can find, and some recommendations that you made right now are on record, so they will be looked at and reviewed for sure, and you know, maybe we can look at your case further. I'd like to, I'll continue on with you and Mr. Sirois, please, if you could share them with us. What are the most common platforms or channels through which you believe the Russian disinformation is being spread in Canada now? I know that there's a long history of it, and quite frankly, we've heard from several experts in this matter that Russia was like the originator of this kind of, in modern day, almost like warfare, information warfare. If you could maybe tell us what you know or what you monitor today with respect to which platforms or channels that are being used right now.
It depends on what kind of public they're targeting. So for younger people, that would be Telegram. For I guess maybe older or maybe people who are not very confident with Telegram, there's Facebook. You can see so many bots on Facebook spreading Russian propaganda, and you can tell that those are not real people because they don't post anything else. There is also Canadians, right, or immigrants in Canada from other countries, and like it would be other different medias, or also experts and professors in universities in Canada who spread Russian propaganda and visit Russia on obviously Kremlin-sponsored trips, and then tell how great everything is in Russia and on occupied territories, and then they tour Canada and spread this information among Canadians. So there are definitely several strategies they use for different groups of people, but I can tell that those are working.
So primarily bots are being used. Is that like the primary
I think this is one
operational tool?
It's one of the tools that they use, but certainly it's not the only one.
Okay, and maybe I'd like to go to Mr. Boyd quickly if I have some time here. Just today, there was reports of TikTok being sued by more than a dozen attorneys general in the United States, alleging the social media platform is misleading the public about its safety, and the app, they say, is harming children's mental health, with some kids getting injured or even dying because of TikTok's viral challenges. Do you have the capacity to sort of monitor trends on TikTok or other platforms? I know there's other youth-based platforms that are used that could impact young people?
We do keep a general, we sort of keep track of what kinds of platforms are being most used by young people. We conduct surveys with teachers and students from across the country to learn about their digital media habits. Certainly, TikTok is still one of the major platforms that is being used by young people. So that is something that we are aware of, and a lot of the times when we use examples of the kinds of misinformation, disinformation that young people might come across, we use examples from TikTok and give students the ability to try to verify and sort of see what's actually true and what's not in the platform.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Boyden, and thank you, Mr. Baines, and appreciate you allowing your time to be used for Ms. Kardasheva to conclude the story. Monsieur Trudel, pour 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
Monsieur Trudel, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Kardasheva, your story was very touching and very troubling, actually. I hope that the government will follow up, because I think that it doesn't make sense. Earlier in your remarks, you stated that analysts were invited to traditional media in Canada who worked for Russia. Do you have the names?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Oui.
The analysts?
Oui, vous avez...
Earlier, you stated that Russia uses different methods to do foreign interference. In Canada, there are people who are invited onto traditional media, not just social media. They're invited on TV, experts who come to talk about the war in Ukraine, for example, and they're paid, they're working, and they're sharing Russian propaganda. Do you have any names that you can share? It's difficult to give names without falling into the risk of defamation. We can talk about what we've heard without giving specific names. There are people who share messages from the Kremlin who have worked with Russia Today in the past. There's a professor who was invited to the foreign interference conference who spoke about not offering support to Ukraine. And that kind of speech can be very problematic for the Russian diaspora. Canada is not, or rather, what is Russia looking for in Canada? Canada is not one of the biggest players necessarily. It's not like France or China or the United States. Canada is a smaller power. What would Russia want with Canada? Perhaps I can answer.
She feels the need.
Canada is an important ally in NATO, for example, the Five Eyes, and is a partner, a very close partner of the United States. So foreign actors like Russia, China, and Iran might seek to go through the back door that is Canada in order to undermine other institutions and public safety. Thank you, Mr. Trudel.
Minutes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. My questions are going to go back to Mrs. Turek. In the book you published in 2019, News from Germany, the Competition to Control World Communications, you uncover how the Germans fought to regulate information at home and use new technology to manufacture, or I should say magnify their powers abroad, showing that information warfare has existed for a long time. You referenced it in your opening statements. I can recall, the documentary of Edward Bernays in The Century of Self in terms of propaganda. This is an age-old political tool. What are the lessons that we can learn from history that we can draw on to find solutions to the current problems of disinformation and misinformation that we face today?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think there are a whole host. One is, as I've said, looking broadly at international relations to try and predict which countries are going to engage in this. This is actually probably much cheaper than some other modes of foreign interference. So we need to be on the lookout for that using our international relations hat, number one. Number two is, I think, really being on the lookout for how new technologies get used. The German story is of the Germans seizing on a new technology, whereas others like the British were relying on older technology and sort of didn't see this coming to a certain extent. So we need to be forward thinking in that regard. And then the third, I think, lesson is that there's a lot that we can do, right? So we're not powerless in this regard. We have faced similar situations before with new technology, so we shouldn't just throw up our hands and say, the internet is unprecedented, Gen AI is unprecedented, there's nothing we can do. There's actually a lot of this that's precedented. We can look at examples of how we've tried to deal with this before to see what's worked and what hasn't.
When you mentioned that we need to be, predicting which countries would use it, I slipped up. I said companies because there's also a whole host of non-state actors. Can you speak to the ways in which non-state actors also use these tools online? I talked about the commodification of information, and you spoke a little bit about data sovereignty. But so if you could speak about that, and then also if you can just talk about just how ubiquitous this is, because really I think it's safe to say all countries are in some way or another accessing this type of disinformation tool.
Yeah, we've got very limited time for the answers, so go ahead, please.
Yeah, so only to say there's obviously a very small number of companies, so we need to pay attention to how they're making money, mainly through advertising, and think about how we might regulate that, and also thinking about what public options could look like, which is what we did in the past with radio and television.
Mr. Green, that concludes our panel for today. I want to thank everyone for appearing. Professor, I understood you to say that you were going to supply the committee with a copy of a study that you had done. So if you could do that, I'll make sure that the clerk follows up with you. And I want to thank the Alliance for being here. I understand you've been very busy appearing before parliamentary committees over the last little while. So thank you again for taking the time to be before our committee. And Mr. Boyd, thank you as well. Just before we go, I'm just about to publish Thursday's agenda. Mr. Baines, Your witness will be on Thursday, and I apologize. The way it was formatted, we actually didn't see the name on the Excel spreadsheet, but it was there after we went back. So I know you brought that up in the last meeting, but he will be here on Thursday. And the other thing that I have to mention to the committee as well is that the social media companies have agreed to come after the Thanksgiving break, which means that we would have to extend this study for another 2 meetings. I propose that we do that, given the level of interest and, quite frankly, given the important information that the committee has been given by our witnesses. I'm going to propose that we extend this by another 2 meetings so that we have the social media companies. That includes TikTok, Google, Meta. They're all coming the week after Thanksgiving. So do I have agreement among committee members? Monsieur Trudeau, vous êtes en accord avec ça? Okay. So we're going to do that, and we'll see everybody on Thursday. Thank you for all your contributions. And to our witnesses, thank you on behalf of Canadians for being here today and providing us with some valuable information. Meeting's adjourned. Thank you.